Hello, hello. Welcome to meaningoflife.tv. My name's Vlad Chituc. I'm an associate in research at the Center for Advanced Hindsight at Duke University, where I do research with Dan Ariely on decision-making very broadly, moral judgment very specifically, and on the side, I do a lot of freelance writing, where I did this interview with our guest today at religiondispatches.com for the Qubit, which is their science portal. Shout out to them, and our conversation now is continuing from a conversation we had there, which we're going to link below. But my guest today is Frank Bures. Frank, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Frank Bures, and I'm a writer in Minneapolis. I do a lot of travel writing, a lot of science writing, a lot of kind of general magazine writing, and I recently had a book published called The Geography of Madness, Penis Thieves, Voodoo Death, and Search for the Meaning of the World's Strangest Syndromes. And it's about it's kind of about culture-bound syndromes, or cultural syndromes they're called now, and sort of what they are and how they work. And in the end, it's kind of a book about what is culture and how does it become part of us, and how does it affect us in ways that we don't really understand.
Yeah, so I think, obviously it's got a very catchy title. So typically when I think about culture, I'm not necessarily thinking about penis theft or voodoo death. But I think you make a pretty compelling case that circumstances like this and diseases like this actually provide a really good window into understanding our culture. So could you explain a little bit about how you got into studying penis theft and what exactly that can tell us about our culture, even here in the United States?
Yeah. So I first sort of heard about penis theft. I was reading BBC and around 2001, and there were these stories of people getting killed in Nigeria and Benin and West Africa for being accused of having stolen somebody's penis, and then a crowd would sort of kill them. And it was, I think, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but it was like 8 and 11 people killed in 2 separate incidents in that year. Something like that, and I was really struck by that. I thought it was a great story, or really interesting, but also what to me was most interesting was how nobody doubted that it was true enough that they would actually kill the people. And having had a few cross-cultural experiences myself, I sort of had an idea of how much other people's ideas affect us, and how when you get inside a culture, how everything makes so much sense that doesn't seem to make sense from the outside. And so this is what seemed like a good, like you said, window into how a culture works and how it exists. And so I wanted to go there and kind of not sort of investigate if penises were really being stolen or not, but sort of to look at what that experience would be like to be in that world where such a thing were possible. And so that was kind of how I got started on this, and then ultimately figured out that it's considered kind of a cultural syndrome. It's a mental condition that only occurs in certain cultures. Like there can be isolated cases in our culture, but it won't spread to other people because we don't believe that sort of thing is possible. Whereas you can have epidemic in Nigeria and in China, where I also went to investigate these sorts of things. A lot of different places in kind of Southeast Asia have a similar thing, but then some places just don't. And so it's a really clear illustration of how just living in a different world where people tell different stories and believe different things can cause you to have different kinds of mental illnesses.
Yeah, so I think one of the most interesting things I took away from the book as I was reading it. So this is a line I came up with as I was writing the introduction to our interview, which I was very proud of. But I mean, if you look at other sorts of injuries, say in the United States, like my bone isn't going to break any differently than a 26-year-old dude in Nigeria. But it does seem like when it comes to our mental illnesses or mental faculties, there does seem to be a difference in when things go wrong, how they go wrong. So what do you think it is about specifically like Nigeria that makes it so susceptible to, like, I'm kind of hesitant to call them superstitions, given the arguments you make in your book, but
yeah. No, I mean, I wouldn't call it superstitions because that's sort of superstitions are what we call other people's beliefs that we don't sort of share, and we have our own beliefs that, other people don't necessarily share. And ours kind of center around physical properties and physical things and sort of a mechanistic understanding of things. And we really believe strongly in that. And so that, your arm won't break the same way, but the way that you kind of, your belief in the power of sort of the healer and the medicine you're getting also can affect the course of your recovery and things like that. So there is an element of that in that. It's going to be a lot less strong than in something like a mental illness. But one of the things I kind of came to in over the course of the book was this thinking that almost all illnesses can be thought of in this kind of looping way, with one part that's sort of more physiological, one part that's more sort of psychological, or beliefs and expectations. And, some of those are going to have a really strong biological part of the loop, and some are going to have a really strong psychological part of the loop. But they all have a little bit, at least, of each of those. And I think a lot of the things that we tend to think of everything more on the biological side, or the sort of mechanistic side, but there's that piece that's there that you can see in some of these conditions that that we wouldn't really expect to be there, even though from the outside it would be clear to other people who are not part of our culture.
Yeah. So just to sort of hone in on penis theft, you call it koro.
Yes.
I think there's another name. So what's it called in China? If you
in China, it's called suyang, I think, in Mandarin, and then and shukyang in Cantonese. And so it's got a lot of different names. Like in Thailand, they call it rupju, and there was another. I can't remember all the names, but the koro, the word, comes from a word on the island of Bujanese, which I don't know which island that is. It's in Indonesia, but it means the head of the turtle.
All right. So
that's originally where it comes from, like in the 1800s, I think.
Yeah. So the idea is that someone who's afflicted with koro, you have this really great scene early in your book where you describe sort of walking through. Is it Nairobi? Where you're walking through
Lagos,
right?
in
Sorry.
Nigeria.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So you're walking through the city and you're trying to bump into people to see, because I guess this is the way that koro sort of spread, is just this physical contact where someone kind of bumps into you. And the idea is that they literally steal your penis. So your penis starts retracting into your body and then you die. Is that?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and it's always that kind of bumping in or doing something weird that seems like intentional, but the person can't quite figure out what the intention is, and there's like suspicion there, and then the victim sort of feels their genitals shrinking into their body. And there hasn't really been much research on whether there is actual shrinkage, because with sort of fear and cold, you can sort of pull, your genitals can kind of pull a little bit into your body. So it's possible there's that element going on there too, but in Nigeria, people believe it's magic, and that your penis is kind of gone or shrinking or being stolen for magic, and you have to like get this person and get them to give it back, otherwise you're gonna die.
And this does.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and this does happen almost exclusively in men. Are there cases of like women contracting?
Yeah, there's cases of men. It's usually a smaller percentage, like 10 or maybe 20%. It differs by case, but usually women feel their breasts are being pulled into their body, I think, is what the usual scenario is. Like in China, in Hainan Island, where I went, where there was a huge epidemic. It's different. Like, it's a different idea of what's going on there. It's more to do with sort of hot and cold elements, or ghosts, or something like that. Some mix of those things. There was one of the things that was reported was women putting iron pins through their nipples to keep them from being retracted into their bodies. Wow. And sometimes they get infected, and so that was one of the injuries people had from the epidemic. Wow. Also some pulling injuries. But when I was there, so a year after about a year after I left. I was there in 2013, and then the next year, my translator emailed me and said that a friend of hers who's from Hainan Island, this in southern China, from this town called Ladong, which was one of the places where they have these things, that a woman was playing cards there, and she felt like her breasts were being pulled into her body, and went into panic, and then the whole town went into panic. And we don't have any numbers for that epidemic, because it was just sort of didn't really become an official thing. But that was an example of a woman having it and kind of starting a epidemic there just recently.
Yeah. So so you told this great story about this school in China, which I think sheds a little bit of light on the sort of social transmission.
Yeah. It happened in a little village called Fuhu in southern China, south of Guangzhou a little bit.
Yeah.
And this boy was playing ping pong, and he felt his penis being shrinking into his body, and he panicked and he ran home, and his parents called the local healer, and they and this old woman, she was like 80 years old. She gave him some treatment, some traditional Chinese medicine treatments, and said, this is dangerous, this is what you need to do. So then he went back, and I think he told the principal or told his friends or something. Yeah. Anyway, the principal gathered all 700 or so students into the courtyard and announced that this thing had happened to this kid. I don't know if he named him, but that would be sort of traumatic, I would think. But he described in detail this thing that happened. It says it's very dangerous, so if it happens to you, be sure to get treatment for it. And then the next day, some more kids it happened to, and then the next day, some more kids it happened to, and then by the end, it was, I think, like 64 kids who had this, and I like that story because it kind of illustrates how these things happen. You hear these stories, and they become, they're especially powerful when it happens to somebody you know, not somebody who's far away. So somebody you know personally, those stories are more powerful than sort of distant ones. But you sort of hear about these stories. They become possible, then they become familiar, and then they become real. And always when they interview people who these have happened to, they all have previous knowledge of it. And so that's a condition for having it, is to know about it and know how it works and to believe that it's a dangerous thing. And so that's sort of where the belief thing side comes into things.
Yeah, and then so there seems to be an interesting sort of connection between these sorts of cultural syndromes, like the one you see in China, and then things like, for example, voodoo death, which you discuss a little bit, where literally the belief that you think you're dying or that someone has cursed you causes you to actually end up dying. So in what sense? Because that does seem like, when you just hear about it, it seems really spooky and kind of weird. Like, it's easy to say, like, okay, these kids are just really scared. Maybe their penises are retracting like a little bit, but it's not sinking all the way into their bodies. Like, it's not going to go missing. They're not going to die. But then you hear stories about people who think they've had a curse placed on them or think they're going to die, and they actually end up dying. And that seems a little harder to sort of square away with our sort of modern conceptions of like how the world and our bodies work. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that kept coming up, and I was really fascinated by that because it does get into it does take it kind of a step further, and I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. There's a lot of anecdotal cases of that in the literature, but it's really hard for obvious reasons to research, ethically, because you can't just sort of do that. But it does happen where people feel, and this kind of led me into I was already sort of into the placebo-nocebo research, which is kind of where the rubber hits the road for these things, where your beliefs kind of are translated into actual physical processes. Yeah,
so I think probably most of our viewers are familiar with the placebo effect, but could you explain a little bit more what the nocebo effect is?
Yeah, okay, so, well, first let me say the placebo effect. Most people, when they think of the placebo effect, they think it's a sort of a perceptive thing, or just a kind of imaginary thing, and that's actually not quite the case, according to all the sort of most recent understanding of it. There's a great book by Fabrizio Benedetti that kind of lays out, I think it's called Placebo Effects, that lays out all the kind of most recent understanding of it. Our understanding of it started to change because of some experiments, some in the 70s and 80s, where I think the first one was where they induced the placebo effect in people. They gave them a placebo painkiller, and then they surreptitiously would give them naloxone, which is an opiate antagonist, which would counter any opiates in their system. And without telling them that they were getting this, their pain would start to increase. And so the body's actually producing an opiate that is being then negated by the naloxone, and that sort of understanding has grown a lot. We know a lot more about that, how it works and stuff, but it's a good example of how, like, it's not necessarily just an imaginary thing, but it kind of feeds into our opiate system, and also there's every system is different in how it works and how much it works and how well it works, and Benedetti has it kind of chapter by chapter, but it's really fascinating. Like, for example, if you have a deep brain stimulus thing in the head of a Parkinson patient and you turn it on, but don't tell them, you need twice as much voltage to get the same effect as if you tell them you're turning it on.
Oh, wow.
And so it's always kind of both our belief in it and the actual physical processes that are working together, and they seem to work better together than separately, and for a lot of complicated reasons. But the nocebo effect is just the opposite of that. You know, when you can have negative effects from negative expectations, and there have been a lot of, or there have been some studies of that. You know, in a roundabout way, like. In one of Ted Kopchak's studies, they told people about the possible side effects, and then they'll have people drop out because they get the side effects in the placebo arm of the study. So they're actually not getting the drug, but they are experiencing these effects. And some of, I think one of them, they had 3 people had to drop out because their side effects were so severe. And so you can't really say that they're not real.
Yeah.
But you can say they're not caused by the drug. And so the idea is that the nocebo effect or the voodoo death is kind of an extreme example of that. And obviously we don't know how it works, but I found like tons of anecdotal cases in the literature about that. One was a young woman who came into this hospital in Baltimore in 1967, and she had she had a kind of heart was racing, and they thought she had heart failure, and she had all these problems, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. And then, like, toward the end of her stay, she told them that she had been born near the Okefenokee Swamp, and on Friday the 13th, and two other women had been born that same day, and then they had all been cursed. This woman who delivered her was a root worker, which is there's a southern kind of hoodoo, which is religion, which is sort of mixed West African and Native American herbalism. And she told them they were all cursed. The first one was supposed to die before her 16th birthday. The second one was supposed to die before her 21st birthday, and the third one before her 22nd birthday. And then the first one did die in a car crash, I think, the day before her 16th birthday. Oh, wow. Then the second one went out on her 21st birthday. She thought she was free and clear, and she went out to a bar and to celebrate, and then she got shot by a gun that went off. Somebody had a fight, and then she was accidentally shot. And so the third woman thought for sure she was going to die before her 22nd birthday, and then like the day before her birthday, she did actually die. And so there's a question of how that works, and what are the processes involved, and we don't basically really know. But there's a lot of other cases of that too. There was one in 1974 in Kentucky. This guy was told he had esophageal cancer and he was going to die in 2 weeks. He had 2 weeks to live. Oh, wow. And then 2 weeks later he died, and they opened him up, and there's no esophageal cancer. You know, um, but you can find also things like this in bigger data sets too,
Mm-hmm.
like the Framingham Heart Study. There was a really good study of that where they found that women who believed they were at risk of dying of heart disease were 3.6 times more likely to die of heart disease than women who didn't believe that who had the same risk factors. So, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so I mean, like, again, I don't want to suggest we're positing anything like spooky or supernatural or like weirdly metaphysical when we're talking about this. Like, we're not saying that people's penises are actually disappearing, or that they're actually voodoo curses, or that, you know, you can actually get cursed and then sort of die on your birthday. But it does, I think, highlight this really interesting psychological literature on just the ways our beliefs and expectations literally physically impact us. And so I'm curious, you know, when it comes to things so like voodoo, or when it comes to things like penis theft, and you gave a few more examples, cross-cultural examples in your book. I think the sort of typical, maybe a little chauvinistic Western response is to be like, oh, well, they're just uneducated, they're just superstitious. What we need to do is teach them some science, and then we can nip that in the bud. So what's your sort of response to something like that?
Well, that's an old that gets into just sort of how complicated the word culture is and what we mean when we say it, and that particular understanding, I heard that a lot actually, even abroad when I was in China and Hong Kong and stuff. Once people are educated, this won't happen anymore. And so one way that goes is to ask, well, what is education? Is it teaching a different way of thinking? Is it just teaching our way of thinking? Is it teaching people to question new ways of thinking, or what is it exactly? But that specific kind of narrative is an old kind of colonial narrative, which comes out of an idea of culture that came from E.B. Tyler, who I talked a little bit about in my book, who came up with this idea that that culture. It was not just him. There was a lot of people talking about this and thinking about it at the time, but his paradigm kind of became the dominant one for whatever reason, where like in the past, people were savages, and then they just lived according to their impulses, and then started to develop a little bit of morals and things like that, and they became barbarians. And then eventually they developed rationality and things like that, and started using utensils, and then they became civilized, which is like Britain, basically. So, that idea that there was this kind of straight line evolution, and we are up here, and we have to help people down here get up to where we are, is kind of that same thing. And it sounds silly when you say it like that almost nowadays, because we have a more nuanced understanding of it and how cultures evolve and what they are and what they do. And one of the things I wanted to do in my book was to kind of hold a mirror up to that, and just because when you first hear about penis stealing, that's exactly what you think. Then when you start to look at our own cultural syndromes, like premenstrual syndrome or carpal tunnel syndrome, or even something like depression that varies widely over cultures, and it has a cultural component, then it becomes less easy to kind of look down our noses at other people and their beliefs, and how their beliefs sort of feed into their own illnesses and health.
Yeah. So as I was reading your book, one of the studies that sort of left to mind was the sort of suicide epidemics that happen. So there's actually this really interesting research showing how suicide in the West is kind of contagious. So, sort of the same with mass shootings. Like we've completely sort of revamped the way we discuss mass shootings, because
David Phillips who does that?
I don't remember off the top of my head. That sounds right, but I could be making that up. But I mean, like, for example, like when Marilyn Monroe killed herself, they like sort of tracked suicides afterwards of like people jumping out the windows, specifically people who look like Marilyn Monroe, and they tracked that like there was a 12% in sort of similar suicides. So like 300 people who were dead,
Hmm.
I think it was the month of October. So if you compare that October to like the October after and the October before it, there's something like 300 people. It seems like her suicide inspired to kill herself.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it
yeah,
does seem like these sorts of things are, having decent science education doesn't seem to completely get rid of these sorts of things in the West. Can you give a few more examples of where you see these sort of you discuss some of the cross cultural
yeah.
research on like
Absolutely,
depression, but
absolutely. Yeah. Actually, just to build on that,
yeah.
David Phillips, this guy who's done a lot of this sort of research, had I think a paper out where he looked at car accidents, single person car accidents after
Yeah.
celebrity death, and there's a slight uptick in those. And his theory was that these are suicides, actually, not just accidents. And so, but he also did a lot of other super interesting research about how belief in Chinese medicine affects your mortality if you have a certain kind of condition that you believe you're susceptible to because of your birth year and stuff like this.
Yeah.
But going back to the contagion idea, that was one of the most fascinating things. I mean, like carpal tunnel syndrome is a good one. It seems like something that's just mechanical. It's purely because of how you're holding your wrist, and it's just your nerve like rubbing against your wrist. But actually, those things like carpal tunnel syndrome have come and gone in time, and actually right now, and you can see how they become part of this narrative ecosystem where everybody's talking about it, everybody's worried about it, and then the incidents start to go up and up and up, and then at some point people stop worrying about it, and then it goes down. Right now, it's on its way out. It's not really diagnosed very much at all, or people don't really have it now. Another one that's really interesting is sort of lower back pain, which is nobody fully understands all the risk factors, what causes it, and things like that. But these researchers in Germany, after Germany was unified in 1991, I think, they did an all-German health study, and in East Germany, they had a lower rate of back pain than West Germany by 16 points or something. Pretty significant. Yeah. And over the next 5 or 6 years, it started going up until it kind of met the West German rates, and then since then they've tracked together. And so the researchers who wrote the paper were suggesting that sort of West German narratives about back pain were sort of permeating into East Germany and causing the rates of back pain to go up there. And so that's an example of a contagious thing. But these other guys who wrote this book, Christalis and Fowler, I can't remember how to pronounce the name, but they've done a lot of. Their book was called Contagion, I think, or Contagious, or something like that. And they looked at the Framingham heart data and tracked how different things flow through the networks, and something like obesity can be contagious, but the way it flows is through socially, not geographically. And so if somebody named someone as a friend and that person became obese, then your chance of becoming obese grew. Whereas if they didn't, there was no relationship or no flow of it. And so I think to a bigger extent than we appreciate, a lot of these things kind of flow through society in a way that we haven't really fully appreciated until now. I mean, penis theft, from penis theft, which goes really fast, lower back pain, to obesity, to gluten intolerance would be another one that I'm sure you could show flow really strongly socially. And so and it works almost exactly like it would work on Hainan Island with penis theft. Somebody you know tells you about this thing that it happened to somebody they knew, and they explain it, and then you understand what the cause is, and so it kind of affects your causal perception. And that's kind of the thing at the root of all this is your causal perception. What do you think are the forces, kind of the basic forces at work? And in our culture, we think it's chemistry or
Yeah.
physical processes. In Nigeria, they think it's magic. In another culture, they would think it's something else. I can't think of an example, but
Yeah.
So that's kind of it's the same process in a way.
Yeah. So I think there's this sort of interesting, bigger picture kind of ethical question that sort of stems through a lot of this really interesting research you discussed. I think we talked about it a little bit in our past interview. But so for example, I was recently listening to this podcast, Reply All. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's fantastic. Silent Media. Would 100% recommend. It's delightful. But they did this episode on they're called tulpamancers. So there's this great Vice article in a New York Times op-ed that discussed people who basically, like, through sheer force of will kind of create imaginary beings into existence who sort of like live in their heads with them. And it's really interesting, and it's something I kind of want. So for obvious reasons that we're going to discuss.
What is it called?
So they're called tulpamancers, and the entities they create are called tulpas. I guess it's based on, I think, some ancient Tibetan tradition or something. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's something. There's a lot of cool, interesting stuff you can read about it. And I want to handle this delicately, kind of for the reasons we're about to discuss. Like, I think it's kind of easy to make fun of them because there are some of these people. Yeah. They say they have like robot cats who, in My Little Pony characters who are living in their brains with them. But they say they're just as real as you are. They have consciousness. They can take over my body sometimes when I let them. As a sort of less extreme example, even something like dissociative identity disorder, where, a few decades ago, there were, only a few cases. On average, they only had one or two multiples. Whereas now, there are like tens of thousands of cases who on average have like dozens. Some even say they have hundreds or thousands. People that they're, saying inhabit their bodies with them. So when you're looking at something like tulpas or dissociative identity disorder or penis theft or voodoo death, there's an obvious sort of dismissive way you can talk about it where it's like, well, yeah, it's obviously not real. Like, obviously there isn't a robot cat living in your brain. Obviously your penis isn't disappearing. Obviously you're not voodoo cursed. But it does seem like in a very tangible way, which I don't want to sort of minimize or be super flippant towards, it does seem real to the people who are experiencing it. I don't want to say it's not real in the sense that they're making it up. So I'm wondering, like, in terms of people who are like writing and thinking and discussing about this sort of stuff publicly, is there like a way to responsibly say, no, the robot cat in your head probably isn't real, without sort of minimizing what they're experiencing, or while sort of sensitively discussing it? Or even just, as scientists, is there a way to say, no, there aren't robot cats in people's heads, while still sort of, with sufficient respect and consideration, handling? And I think it's like a thorny ethical issue that I haven't quite 100% figured out where I stand yet. And I'm curious to hear what some of your thoughts are.
That is very tricky. It is easy to make fun of those people.
And I really want to resist that urge because that's like, it's too easy. But
for the same reason, it's easy to make fun of like penis stealing, But at the same time, to the person it happens to, it's like deadly serious.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, good example is speaking in tongues.
Yeah.
Which for a lot of the 20th century, a lot of doctors wanted to call a pathology or a mental illness, and except that there's no really negative effects of it, and it's part of somebody's religion, and you can't say to them, and it's the same thing. You can't say, no, you're not really speaking to God or whatever is happening, because to them it's completely real. And so I don't know what the right. I mean, you can always privately feel like it's not real. It's never going to feel real if you're not in it.
Yeah.
But to realize, and maybe just a little bit of humility, to realize that there are things that we believe that are fully 100% real that are maybe not.
But
like for example,
that
PMS is caused by hormonal shifts or something like that. If you tell that to a woman in our culture, they tend to get mad, even though there's a lot of evidence that it's probably not correlated with hormonal levels or things like that,
Yeah.
and it's based on an old idea that comes from Hippocrates about women not being able to kind of control their uterus or
Yeah.
something like that. And um, so I don't know. I mean, I guess just to when you're talking about these weird things and other people's beliefs, to remember that we have our own too.
Yeah, because I mean, I could imagine like if a Nigerian writer came to the U.S. and wrote a book about multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder, kind of along
Yeah.
the same vein of like, oh, I was doing this traveling and I met all these people who thought they had like dozens of people living in their heads, and that kind of
Mhm.
had me on a soul searching journey to figure out what culture was. Like I could
Yeah.
imagine people in the U.S. I think you're in a somewhat unique position where you can talk about this just because the people you're talking about probably aren't going to read the book.
Right.
But
Right.
like I can imagine, like I could like obviously I'm not a woman. I don't experience PMS, but I could imagine there being this sort of kind of annoyed and pissed off reaction where you're kind of
Hmm.
like, oh look, scientists, these like men who are coming here telling me, what I'm experiencing in my own body, like it's just the sort of
Yeah.
gendered bias in science. Like it's tricky to discuss these things without seeming
Right.
like you're minimizing the experience of
Mhm.
what. So yeah, it's just this interesting and delicate ethical issue that I'm not sure I figured out how best to handle yet. But
Yeah, I don't
I
know. I
think
mean,
it's cool.
it's a little bit different. It feels a little bit different to me when you're talking about things that have been around for a while and
Yeah,
have a long history or something like that, than something like this, what you're talking about, that sort of is come out of like it's just sort of seems like it's come out of nowhere.
yeah,
But it depends how I guess it depends how you approach it too. It's like I'm as a writer, I have sort of the luxury of approaching it as like, well, that's interesting. I wonder
yeah,
what that's like to have all
mhm,
these cats living in your head, and so to try, and that would be one way to approach it, just to be like to try to figure out what is
mhm,
that like and what does that feel like and
yeah,
what is that sort of experience like and what's behind maybe even
mhm,
what's behind that experience so but and also if you were a psychiatrist maybe your approach would be, well, is this having any negative effects
yeah,
on the person, how is it affecting their life
mhm,
somehow, if not then whatever, but
yeah,
I don't know, maybe it's helping them somehow.
yeah,
Who knows? I don't know.
yeah,
It's really hard to speak to other people's reality and
yeah.
what is and the narrative ecosystem that they feel like they're part of.
Yeah, I wanted to also talk a little bit about. So we wrote this great article. We wrote two recent great articles, one for Undark, one for Scientific American, that I wanted to discuss. But I guess sort of as a way to transition, I think into your Undark piece, you're very
Hmm.
critical of what you call, I think, the biochemical model
Yeah,
of the sort of ways our
the
bodies work.
biomedical model.
Yeah, the biomedical model.
Hmm.
And you're sort of critical of the idea of like treating, for example, the body as if it were a machine or our brains as if they were computers. And
Yeah.
as someone who I think I'm a bit more sympathetic to those models, but I'd like to hear you at least like lay out your sort of case where you think they're inadequate and what you think is maybe a bit better.
Yeah, so I mean, part of it comes from what I was saying before
Yeah.
about this idea of all illness and health really being
Mhm.
being this part of this kind of looping effect where our expectations and beliefs kind of feed into our biology, our
Yeah.
physiology, and vice versa. And when you look at something like mental illness,
Yeah.
we've really focused on the biological side of that loop
Hmm.
and trying to find these sort of magical chemicals that will make people feel better.
Yeah.
Whereas the other side of it has been, apart from cognitive behavioral therapy, kind of does try
Yeah.
to address that side of it, but the whole pharmaceutical side of it is purely based on the physiological side,
Hmm.
and we really in 50 years have not come up with any biomarkers for any mental illness or any test that you can take to see if you're depressed. Or I mean, the idea that serotonin causes depression is kind of on its way out,
Yeah.
and so we're back to kind of zero with that stuff.
Hmm.
And I think if you go back from that a little bit, I think what it goes back to is that the mechanistic understanding of the body and mind goes back to kind of this effort to try to get rid of dualism, which
Yeah.
is the idea that there's a body and a mind and they're
Hmm.
separate and stuff. And but I think there's evidence that, the Michael Gazzaniga talks a lot about this in his book, of what's it called? Who's in Charge?
Yeah.
About how, it's called strong emergence, where you know what emergence is, where complex systems evolve from small sort of repeating actions, and there's two ways to kind of understand that. One is that so an ant is just a simple thing. Yeah. It can't really do very much, but when it reaches a certain critical mass of ants, they become like an intelligence, and they can make a colony, and they can move their eggs when they need to, and act as one sort of thing. And so, if you think that a weak emergent understanding is the idea that you should be able to look at this ant and understand how it becomes a colony. But a strong emergent understanding is that at some point the complexity changes the rules by which the thing is functioning. Yeah. And so you can't necessarily use the same rules to understand the ant that you use to understand the colony, because they're obeying different rules. Like the same way Gazzaniga talks about how you can't look at a car part and understand traffic. Yeah. Because it's just they're operating according to different rules, and he applies the same theory to the brain and the mind. And so the brain is like the parts, the small parts, and at some point it reaches a level of complexity where you can't reverse engineer it to the parts, and that would be the self. Yeah. And the self then, because it's past this what he calls a phase shift, can work backwards and change the system that it's part of. And we know that's true. We know that meditation can change our gene expression, and we can alter all our physical processes to a certain extent with our, just by changing our ideas and our expectations. And that's I think the piece that is missing, the idea that we're going to find all these things, solutions to our problems just in pure physical form, I don't think is going to be sufficient ever, because you have this self and this idea of the self, and I think that's a really important thing. And how solid your sense of self is affects how your physiology is functioning. I think I mentioned in that in the interview we did about how George Engel did this study of people who died suddenly, and he looked at 170 cases, and things precipitated it, like the loss of a spouse or a sibling or friend, or loss of a job, or the demolition of a hotel where a guy worked for 30 years. And one of his explanations was that all these people experienced like a loss of control, or a sense that the person no longer has or no longer believes that he has control over his situation or his self. And so when your self kind of disintegrates, that's when you start to get some of the negative effects we see with the nocebo effect. So I don't know. Did I answer the question?
You did. So I don't know. Maybe we're gonna get buried in semantics, and it might not be a super helpful direction to go into. I think I'm inclined to read this literature. And I'm just really surprised and encouraged that I just think the sort of physical way our brains work is just a lot more complicated than we initially thought. Yeah. So of course you're not going to be able to just mess around with serotonin levels and cure depression. Right. SSRIs are really helpful. I think it's a little bit of a mystery how helpful they are, but on average they tend to be just as good as, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy. And but what that's doing is just changing. So that's changing what CBT does. Is it just changes the way the brain works, and of course that's sort of physical. So again, maybe we're just
as well or better than for certain people as well or better than pharmaceuticals. Yeah. And but the question is going to come up soon, I think, is that whether the amount that SSRIs worked was because of our belief in it. Yeah. And there's this issue that they're coming. Steve Silverman wrote an article about this, and maybe a book also about how over the last few years, drug companies have had this trouble where their drugs can't beat the placebo anymore. The placebo effect of antidepressants has gotten stronger, whereas they used to be able to pass that, and then that's deemed effective. But now they're getting the same results, but the placebo effect is stronger, and so it's technically ineffective, even though. So why is the placebo effect growing with antidepressants? And I think it's because of 20 years of inoculation with stories about how powerful antidepressants are that's kind of contributing to that. And so those are the kind of things that a purely mechanistic understanding of the body and mind can't really account for. And I think a lot of these things are fluid processes in a way. There's not, then to think of them in kind of hard mechanistic terms, I think can be counterproductive.
Yeah. Well, so let me quibble with that a little bit, because I took Introduction to Cognitive Science about like 7 years ago, so I'm a little bit hazy on the details. But I remember learning about Turing machines. Are you familiar with what a Turing machine is?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea, again, I'm probably going to butcher this, but the idea is like there's kind of a tape and there's a machine that either say writes a 1 or a 0, and there are certain rules about how much the tape should move forward, how much the tape should move backwards. It has the ability to write numbers and has the ability to erase numbers, and so on. And the idea is that any kind of computation that's possible, you can, in a very complicated, very ridiculous way, you can instantiate purely on this one little Turing machine with the right algorithms or whatever. So you can still get these sort of like recursive things. You can still get, algorithms impacting the physical tape. You can go back and rewrite things. I don't think that's necessarily incompatible with a purely mechanistic account. Again, what I think is the mistake here is suspecting that the mechanistic account's a lot more simpler than we're probably giving it credit for. So I think if I think there's been this reductive idea, which I think has been probably a little counterproductive. I agree. Where basically we just once we started being able to do fMRI studies that were half decent, we were just kind of like, screw psychology. All we need to do is understand the brain and we're going to be fine. But I think, a lot of interesting things happen on the psychological level, whether you want to call that strong emergence or not. I think there are interesting ways to talk about this. But I do think there's a strong case to be made for sort of distinctive, specialized sciences. I think psychologists and neuroscientists are doing different things. I don't think that makes it less mechanistic or less physical. But again, I think we're just arguing semantics at this point.
No, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, there was a period where neuroscience was considered kind of thought to be going to answer all our problems and explain everything and stuff. And I think we're sort of getting beyond that a little bit now. And biomedicine, by the way, is really powerful and is really important. And I'm not saying it's not, but it primarily came out of a infectious disease model, from developing antibiotics and vaccines, and so that is, for those things, it's good enough. It's more than good enough to, even though there is a little bit of mental side to that with your immune system and those sorts of things, but when you start to try to apply that then to mental illnesses or other things, or chronic pain or other things that are more complex and where yourself is a bigger presence in those things, then it starts to fall apart a little bit.
Yeah. So, and I want to make sure we covered this really great article you wrote for Scientific American about this sort of very small tribe of runners who sort of produce this sort of like obscenely disproportionate number of like marathon winners and like Olympic gold medalists and stuff. So I just want to give you a chance to sort of say a little bit more about that. And weirdly enough, it does tie into what we're discussing about sort of I'll just let you go. I'll let you just.
No, that article you're talking about is about East African runners and why they're so good now. And it did come out of this same research and same ideas that the book did as well. Whereas kind of the conventional wisdom is that Kenyans and Ethiopians are just genetically better runners than us because of some evolutionary reason, and that always seemed a little bit too easy to me. Yeah. And when you look at this little town called Bekoji in Ethiopia that's produced like 25. It's a town of 16,000 people. Yeah. No dirt, it's dirt roads. There's nothing there really. It's just this one coach who started coaching 30 years ago, and then he had one runner, I think Dara Tulu, who won a gold medal in Barcelona, I think, And then he started getting more runners and come into his camp and stuff, and developed this culture in the village where that combined technical training knowledge that he had or he developed with this belief and this narrative system where, again, when you are training with somebody and you know them and then you see them on the Olympic screen in the bar, it makes that narrative become more possible. It locates the causal, forces more closely to you and think, oh, if this person can do it, I can do it. That's a possible path for me, and at scale that can create these little cultures. And there's a similar place in Kenya that has the same thing. So the genetic idea, obviously health and diet and all those things are important, but it doesn't explain why this one town has all these runners and the town down the road doesn't. So that was kind of the exploration of that idea. And in fact, this year in the Olympics, you saw Americans really make a big comeback in a way that they haven't for a long time. And I think that will change. I mean, the Kenyans and Ethiopians have only been dominating for 20 years, really. And so I think once people start to believe that they can also compete at that level, in a certain way, or not be intimidated, that will change. And I think it is changing. Yeah.
It's interesting how it comes in sort of waves like that. Like you mentioned, I think in the article,
the Finns, in the 30s and 40s, the Finnish runners were the best in the world, and it was all the same sort of environmental explanations were given for but they live in the wilderness and they run through the woods and they're wild people basically, and there are all these climactic theories about they have the right climactic energy there, and so it's very similar to the same kind of things people say about Kenyan runners and Ethiopian runners,
And then I think one of the last things I wanted to chat with you about, I think we should probably wrap it up pretty soon. But I think we talked about this in our interview, but I don't know if you mentioned it in your book, but there was this great story about the Coca-Cola factory.
The Belgian mass psychogenic illness. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about mass psychogenic illnesses, because they're not just, it's not just penis theft in Nigeria. You do see this in the West as well.
Right. There was some people do consider the Koro epidemics like a mass psychogenic illness, and I think obviously these things all happen on a scale, like the way that they flow through populations. Like I was talking about before, the mass psychogenic illnesses are like the same thing on fast forward. They happen really fast. They go really burn out really fast. They go through a population. Like there was a famous laughing epidemic that affected girls in schools in Tanzania in 1963 and 64. That girls couldn't stop laughing, and I found two papers about in Winnipeg, Canada, there was a hiccup epidemic in 1922 that affected 1,000 people, and in 1924 that affected 1,400 people. People couldn't stop hiccuping. It happens a lot, actually, more often than you think. That the thing with the girls in Leroy, New York, where they all had that twitching thing. That was also a mass psychogenic illness, and the reason they knew it was because usually it happens in schools, and it usually affects girls for some reason. There's more, I don't know why, more social receptiveness or something like that nobody understands exactly why, but it doesn't affect their family members or things like that. It's always kind of in a social group. And the Belgian one that you're talking about was in 1999, a bunch of students in a school drank some Coca-Cola, and they had headaches, dizziness, vomiting, abdominal pains, diarrhea, and then it started to spread as people heard about it. It started to spread to other schools. It spread to 5 schools, 147 students, 943 calls to the poison control, and Coca-Cola spent in the end between $100 and $250 million trying to figure out what went wrong, and they could not find anything. And so it's possible that this mass psychogenic illness just cost them $250,000 for to find nothing, basically.
Yeah, I mean, so that sort of reminds me of the sort of Wi-Fi sickness you hear brought up every so often, where people get convinced that Wi-Fi is causing whatever number.
Yeah.
Like, what do you do if you're in a position like Coca-Cola, or if you're someone who wants to have internet at their house? Is there sort of an easy solution to things like
Well,
that?
it's tough because you can't just change people's beliefs.
Yeah.
You can't. You like we were talking about before. You can say, "Well, you're wrong about this," but depending on the context and depending on the person, they could just reject that and say, "No, I'm not wrong, and you're wrong." And so there must be ways to approach people, especially if they're having real problems. I mean, usually with things like the Coca-Cola thing, it just goes away after a little bit.
Yeah.
But with the Wi-Fi thing, I think there's a significant element of that in the gluten intolerance thing that's going on right now. People's negative expectations can really create these sort of symptoms. And another one is the windmill syndrome. Have you heard of that?
I'm not familiar with that. No.
These huge windmills get like a weird thing in their ear, and they get like sick and stuff, and so the symptoms are real, but whether they're caused by the windmills is we don't know, but they're probably not. So I don't know. It's hard to explain that to people, especially when they are experiencing real symptoms. But it's really common, and you can see it throughout history, and you can see it in all over the world.
Yeah, man. Well, so on that note, I think we should wrap up. Frank, it's great chatting with you. Your book, Geography of Madness, would highly recommend. It was a lot of fun reading it, and a lot of fun talking to you about it. Thanks again to Meaning of Life for letting us host this conversation, and to Religion Dispatches and their Qubit vertical for getting us chatting in the first place. It was great, and check out Frank's stuff. All right, take care, dude.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.